Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is David Hart. I'm the chair of the DEI Committee for District 7930. And welcome to our last of our 2023 22-23 discussion series. And tonight's topic, as you know, is going to be cultural awareness. We have a special guest this evening. Her name is Dr. Khan. Dr. Khan is a licensed clinical psychologist and clinical associate professor at Boston University School of Medicine and the Boston Medical Center. She is additionally the training director for the Center of Multicultural Training in Psychology and the director of the Center for Multicultural Mental Health at BU and Boston Medical Center. Dr. Khan, I'd like to turn it over to you and welcome and thank you very much for joining.
So I'll be sharing a whole lot with you tonight, but I want it to be sort of free floating where you can ask questions and engage. Feel free to interrupt me. I'm totally okay with that. And I'm happy to share my slides with you afterwards if you need, and any other additional, content that may be needed by your group in regards to this training. I'm more than happy to provide that as well, okay? So as introduced, I'm actually a clinical psychologist by training, and I conduct the Center for Multicultural Mental Health and the Center for Multicultural Training in Psychology. Almost all of my publications and writing are in the realm of multiculturalism, diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and trauma work. So I do individual trauma work, group trauma work, immigration trauma work, and post-colonial trauma work. And I also write a lot about spirituality and integrating spirituality and other, frameworks of thinking that fall in the diversity realm, and combining that with mental health and how it impacts our well-being of people overall. So I, being that this is a cultural awareness training, I'll share my social identities. So I identify as a Pakistani American cisgendered woman who was born and raised in 3 different continents. So I've lived in Africa for 11 years. I've lived in Asia for 7 years, and I've lived in the US, in upstate New York and in New York City for 17 years. And I've now been in Boston, Massachusetts for the last, since 2010. So that's sort of briefly my trajectory. I speak 7 languages. So issues of multiculturalism and diversity are at the core of my being. Very much interested in it on a personal level as well as professional levels. I've had to adjust to many different countries and languages and cultures and customs and ways of being. And over time, I became very interested in sort of teaching about it and learning about it more so on a personal and professional level. So I'm happy to share any articles in that regard as well. So I'll share probably a resource list with you that could also be useful for future. But again, I'll be talking a lot and you'll be hearing from the content, but I want you to feel open to sort of interrupting in between. Obviously, we'll have time for questions at the end as well. But to start off with, if you could just even introduce yourselves and just briefly tell me your names and what you may be interested in learning or how this training may be, interesting to you. If there's anything that you would like for me to address, I would love to hear that. So if you could just sort of around the screen, just tell me your names and what you do and your interest in this training, that would be really helpful, if that's okay.
I'll break the ice. I'll get started. As I said, why not, right? As I said, my name is David Hart, and I am the of the DEI chair. I'm also 20-year plus professional in human resources and currently work for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So the DEI realm is a big part of what I do. I come from a talent acquisition recruitment background, and I'm now also an operations manager within the Executive Office of Health and Human Services. So, DEI, cultural awareness, is really what I'm dealing with on a daily basis. I'm also a lifelong advocate for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and especially individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, and getting them into the workplace. And I grew up, my brother was profoundly intellectually disabled. He was never able to be in the workplace, but he lived most of his life in an absolutely wonderful facility here in Massachusetts. So that's a little bit of my background. I will go, and I'm going to go down based on my list, or as I see people, and if I miss somebody, please let me know. I'm going to go to Ann Witzig, I think it is.
That's correct. Yes, thank you, David. My name is Ann Witzig. I'm with the Ipswich Raleigh Club, and I'm going to be the president next year. So I'm very interested in DEI, and our community is not diverse, and it's certainly a big topic and of interest to me as we move into my next year. So I appreciate you sponsoring this. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Gail Ralston.
Can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Great. Thank you. I'm Gail Ralston from the Andover Club. I retired last year, but prior to that, I had been on staff at Phillips Academy in Andover. And during 2 years of COVID, when we did not generally go into our offices, we did a lot, or the school sponsored a lot of DEI workshops. So we went through a variety of topics, a variety of seminars. And one of the things that struck me during that time, which has almost become a book that I go to, is comes from the fact that I grew up in I can't describe it any other way than the white side of the south side of Chicago. And there was a dividing line, and I never understood it. But now I'm getting to understand it a little better through a book called The Color of Law, which is basically a story of how the government created deliberate segregation. And that was an eye-opener for me. And that was one of the texts that was suggested that opened my eyes to a lot of things that I hadn't considered before. So I'm happy to be here. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Gail. Lori, our district governor-elect.
Hi, good evening, everybody. Thanks, Dave. My name is Laurie Carrison. I am the district governor-elect. I will be district governor next year. By coincidence, total coincidence, like Dave, I also work for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. I work for the Operational Services Division. I'm the Deputy Assistant Secretary, which is part of the administration and finance arm of state government. I also am supporting a very diverse workforce and work culture. In addition, I sit on the DEI committee within our agency. So we're actually doing a lot of work within our agency regarding DEI, and just actually finished putting together our group's mission statement.
Excellent. Thank you, Lori. Lenore, I apologize. I'm trying to see the name. Yep.
Okay. My name is Lenore Cohen. I am a Sister of Notre Dame de Namur. I work in Ipswich, and I'm in the Ipswich Raleigh Club with Ann. And I think this is about my fourth career right now. I am the development director for the Congregation of the Sisters of Notre Dame worldwide, which has a lot of diversity in itself. However, we work in diverse and not diverse communities in terms of education and healthcare. We meaning the Sisters of Notre Dame. But I have been a principal of a school in Peabody, Massachusetts. I also worked in a shelter workshop in Somerville with developmentally delayed adults and did job training with them. We even we had one job at the State House. It was paper recycling. You learn a lot of stuff when you work with special needs adults. So I myself have a diverse background in terms of what I've been involved in, but not with a lot of diversity within the population that I worked with. And, growing up in a white community, living in a white community, having diverse opportunities to participate in diversified gatherings. I take every chance I can get. And when this was on, I wanted to come and listen and also be able to take some, I don't want to say tips, but just awarenesses back into my workplace too.
Thank you, Sister. Marty Walsh, who is also on the DEI committee.
Unmute, please.
Unmute, Marty. You're muted.
That's better, isn't it?
Yep.
Okay. My name is Monty Walsh, and I am recently retired from a very challenging and active career in human resource management. As a female entering that field in my early years of developing a career, I suffered all the pain and discomfort of being a woman, of being a girl, of being the only girl who ever took on a professional position, as one of the male figures that I worked with told me at one of the companies. Two of my companies, very diverse in their own activities. One was Boston University, where I was the director of human resources for all non-union employees. And then after I left there, I went to Boston Edison. I kind of got hung up on B's, but I went to Boston Edison, which was also heavily unionized, heavily male dominated. I think you know what utilities have been like in the past. And affirmative action was just something that they had great difficulty in dealing with. So I earned a lot of stripes there. I accomplished a great deal. I finally retired from there after close to 25 years, but I am very familiar with the pain, the suffering, but the reward of affirmative action in its broadest sense, what it means and how we need to be aware and to continue to develop and be sympathetic and understand what it means to be quote unquote different, for whatever that is. So I'm still now, I do some consulting. I'm a member of the Winchester Rotary Group. I developed the DEI program for the Winchester Club, and I've been on David's committee for a year and a half, 2 years, I guess it has been, David. So
Yep.
I am very deeply involved in this, and I'm glad to see that we're making such wonderful ground steps forward.
Thanks, Marty. Pooja, who also is a member of the DEI committee.
Thank you, David. My name is Pooja, as you know, and I am from India, and I have lived on 3 continents, Asia and Europe, and now in American continent. I have visited other places also internationally, and I appreciate how culturally people are different and how enriching the experience is when we are talking to them and learning from them. And Rotary had shown me different ways. I was president in the Rotary, so they showed me that there was like no barrier being a woman. So I appreciated that, and I was president, and now I will be governor in 25, 26. At the same time, I go to different places and I see how different some people might be, no matter how much I try to intermingle with them, but still I see that there might be something that I'm not understanding, and I would like to understand something better. Today, maybe I will be a little bit better next time when I'm dealing with different people. They come from different background.
Excellent. Thank you, Pooja.
Thank you.
James Moore.
Thank you. James Moore. I'm in Rockport. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay,
Yep.
good. And I was lucky to have the career which I recently retired, but that was 35 years. I was a diplomat with the U.S. Department of State. And Dr. Khan, I served my second posting back in the 1980s, was in Karachi at the U.S. consulate. And not too much after that, Pooja, I was I served also in India, in Chennai. Way back then, it was Madras. So I'm very interested in what with Dr. Khan and in our conversation. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, James.
Thank you. And I apologize. I'm not going to do very well on this name, but Dr. Zareen Karani. I'm sorry.
No,
I apologize.
that's fine. Zareen is good enough.
Thank you.
I come originally from India. I've been in this country almost 50 years. I've been steeped both in Rotary, since my father was a Rotarian before I was born, and my brother was Rotary governor. I was a president of the Cambridge Club. Then I was in Winchester, and now I'm very proud to belong to the Burlington Breakfast Club. And Pooja has directed me more here because I've had to step away for a little while, but my whole life has been devoted to diversity and inclusion. About 40 years ago, I founded the master's program in intercultural relations and intercultural management that trained cross-cultural trainers at Lesley University. And I've taught managing across cultures across the world, and I'm currently a part-time professor at Boston College in their MBA program teaching managing across cultures. And I also run a company called Managing Across Cultures, and I've worked in about 30 countries. So I was very impressed by the speaker and urged by Pooja. I very much wanted to join. So thank you, Pooja, and I hope I can contribute to this in Rotary in whatever way I can now that I'm coming back into Rotary more actively.
Well, Zareen, you're going to be joining the DEI committee, whether you know it or not.
Yes, yes.
Just suggested that. And now,
Definitely, yes.
if you'll have me, I would love to.
Absolutely, absolutely. And by the way, it's so I don't forget, and I know I will forget by the end of the evening. Obviously, as we all know, our Rotary year is ending in another month or so, but we're always looking for additional DEI committee members. We do meet one night a month. It's usually Tuesday nights at 6 o'clock, but I still have to speak directly with Governor-elect Lori as to see how her schedule is going to work. But it's essentially it's about one night a month, and we generally try to keep our meetings to about 30 to 45 minutes. And as you can see, we do several of these discussion series, and then we'll also talk a little bit more about our DEI citation and so forth. But it's always open to anybody who is interested. Just reach out to me or District Governor-elect Lori or anybody on the DEI committee, and we certainly love to have a chat with you, and feel free to join any of our meetings. So thank you.
Very much. It would be my pleasure.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to Tim Kelly now.
Please.
Oh, hi, everybody. Tim Kelly. I'm with the Reading Rotary Club, and I'm an assistant governor this year. And by practice, I'm an attorney. I have a solo practice here in Reading, and I'm interested. I've been to, I think, a couple of these already, and I'm interested in the topic, and I'm certainly interested in, seeing Rotary grow and become more diverse.
Excellent. Thank you, Tim. Marilyn Bedell.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Bedell. I'm from Rotary District 7850, which is Northern Vermont, Northern New Hampshire, and into Quebec. So we're a bilingual district, and Carrie, I guess, sent the invitation to Mike Carrier, who's our DEI coordinator for the district. I was just interested in the topic and thought I would join you for the evening. By profession, I'm a retired nursing administrator who felt I spent my entire career convincing physicians at times that we were equals.
Thank you and welcome, and thanks for joining us. Guillermo Molina.
Molina, I am a fellow Rotarian, newly fellow Rotarian here in Newburyport, Massachusetts. And as a profession, I work with people from all walks of life. I'm a realtor, and I've been a realtor for over 18 years. And certainly it's a topic that's near and dear to me because I come from a deep Latino community in New York City. And so certainly I've seen my challenges as I've moved from the city into some of the suburbs as far as being accepted. And it's great. And I always carry the torch, and I say to myself, I'm as good as you are. And so certainly I'd like to surround myself with people that are like-minded.
Oh, I think we lost you, Guillermo. You froze up on us.
Being contributors and pioneers.
Excellent. Guillermo, you froze up on us a little bit. We'll come back in a moment, okay? Liz Bratt. Am I saying that right, Liz?
No, everyone says Bratt by mistake. That's okay.
Sorry.
It's Bratt. I'm Liz Bratt. I'm from the Salem Rotary. I'm a retired veterinarian. I sold my practice to the associate doctors a year and a half ago, and the practice is woman-owned, BIPOC-owned now. And I was a member of our DEI, the first DEI committee in Salem 2 years ago, and we did manage to achieve the certificate. And
that's right.
We have a long ways to go, though. We've had some pretty egregious things that I've seen happen. I will not list them here, but there's still a long ways to go. That's all I can say.
Thank you for coming this evening. Ed.
Yes, hello. I am with Lebanon Rotary. I'm the current president, and as you know, my term ends in about 6 weeks. I came to Rotary late in life. I've been a Rotarian for about 5 years. About a year and a half ago, we started on the journey to creating a more diverse, equitable, and inclusive Rotary Club. And I have since joined our District 7850, their their DEI journey. I like the topic. I think we're all in this together, and I'm interested in what Dr. Khan has to say. I'm looking forward to hearing.
Thank you. We'd welcome. Yolanda Lee.
Hi, David. This is Yolanda. I'm from Cambridge Rotary Club. I'm current year president, and DE&I is always my topic. Always interested to learn more, and how to increase the diversity, of the community, for the whole Rotary Club. Because I think Rotary is the most diverse charity club in the world. You go to everywhere, you can meet the Rotarian. I just wear a t-shirt, on the street. People say, hey, I know you, or my family know you, about Rotary, and people invite you to a very interesting place, And I think it's both way, you know, we promote Rotary and also we invite people to join our event or club meetings. All right, I would like to learn more as well. Thank you.
Thank you. My screen just shifted a little bit. Jack Attridge.
Yes, good evening. And thank you for putting this on. I think this is my second. Jack Attridge from Marblehead, longtime club member, two-time past president, and my favorite part of Rotary ever is an advisor of our Interact Club. And so, you know, obviously, the conversations that I have with young people about DEI, you know, is so encouraging to see, and it's somewhat, you know, non-existent in a good way. And so I have faith in our youth and our future, and it's always great to learn, and I appreciate being invited tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for coming. Charles Foscat, I think it is.
Thank you very much. My name is Charlie Foskett, informally, and I guess I'm going to have to bare my soul tonight. I'm a new Rotary member, and I'm here to learn about another aspect of Rotary. I'm just didn't come late in life. I came very late in life, and I've been in Rotary for less than a year. I've been involved in racial equity issues since I lived in Watertown more than 40 years ago when I founded the Watertown Fair Housing Group, and I was also a real estate tester for the NAACP. And I've lived in Arlington for the last 40 years. I recently joined the Arlington Rotary, which I find absolutely fantastic. However, I just want to announce to everybody, truthfully, that I'm a DEI skeptic, and I'm here to learn about it. I should say that my granddaughters are African American. I probably have more Black relatives than I have white relatives, and I love them all dearly. But I am just very skeptical about the whole DEI movement. So I'm strongly in favor of, or strongly against any racial prejudice or discrimination and all of the evil things that are accompanied by that, but I can't get my head around the DEI movement. So I'm here to learn. And I also would mention that in my profession, I work mostly overseas, in India, in South Africa, and in Egypt. And as you can imagine, all my colleagues and partners there are, you know, diverse, to use that popular term. So I'm looking forward to hearing what we have to say tonight, and I'm delighted to be a member of Rotary, and I'm delighted to be here to see and hear what I can do to sort of learn and develop my personal viewpoints. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Charlie. Chris Doctor.
Hi, Chris Doctor, and I'm also in the Ipswich Rowley Rotary Club. Been a member for 20 years, and so my professional life is as an architect, and we do a lot of work with independent schools, private schools. We're doing some work with a boarding school now, and in doing master planning, one of the topics that often comes up is DEI. And so I want to learn as much about it as I can. And master planning is all about placemaking. And so for us, it's thinking about how do we design places on the campus and in the buildings and the intersections of those things that are safe, welcoming, and attract a diverse population. We also just did a project for a school in South Carolina. It was very interesting because they actually referred to what I normally would have called normal as neurotypical, and they actually had 50-50 students that were neurotypical and need-based. And in fact, they were attracting the neurotypical because of the diverse population. And so it was fascinating to sort of see that model. It's a very small school, up and coming. There are a lot of people who are interested in seeing it grow. So that's sort of my interest in this.
Excellent. Thank you, Chris. Guillermo, you had cut out for a while, and I think we missed probably about 30 seconds or so. Do you have anything else you want to add?
No, if you didn't hear, I'm a newbie. I've actually been in Rotary less than a year, and I belong to the Rotary in Newburyport. I am by trade a realtor. I've been licensed for 18 years, and I work with several people from several walks of life. And so, as a member of Rotary, I'm amazed of so many great people, so much people from so walks of life, and certainly, I'm also one who's had some struggles with the fact that I'm a Latino in an environment where sometimes that's a challenge, but certainly I keep writing on, and I know there's a lot of things that we can work on as a group that will change or make changes in our lives.
Excellent. Thank you, Guillermo. And certainly last but not least, our co-host, Terry Curran, who is also our past district governor from last year. Terry.
Thank you, Dave. I'm from the Parkway Club, which is the southern end of the city of Boston. And I've been on the DEI committee for about 4 years since I got onto the track. Fortunately, last year, I was able to give out 6 or 7 of the DEI certifications. And for Charlie, DEI is not all about race. And that is one thing that we put out. People are discriminated against because of their height, because of their width, because of their sexuality, for all things. So our focus is never just on ethnic division. Over the years, all of the programs that we've run stress different things and learning about your own implicit bias, etc. So I would encourage you to go to the new video section on our district homepage and check out some of those past videos. And to Dr. Khan, could you please explain to me what your designation is? Because GIS is something I have never heard before.
Sure. So I am a clinical psychologist by training, and I'm the DEI lead for Boston University. I'm a clinical associate professor. And I run their doctoral psychology training program, the Center for Multicultural Training in Psychology, and the Center for Multicultural Mental Health. And essentially, I teach psychology, I run the training program, I conduct DEI and cultural awareness trainings across inside and outside the campus, as well as conduct health disparities initiatives and the pandemic related disparities committee that I'm part of, as well as I help with AP, American Psychological Association, sort of formulating the guidelines on multiculturalism and diversity in education. So those just broadly like the multiple hats that I wear.
I guess you didn't understand my question. You identified as, and you used a term that I'm not familiar with. And if I'm not familiar with it being on the committee, I'm sure that most other people.
Which term are you referring to, Terry?
You didn't identify as female or male. You identified as something else.
No, I did. So I identify as a Pakistani American Muslim cisgendered heterosexual.
That's it, cisgender. That's what a term I had never heard.
Yeah. So cisgender is a term that's utilized to reflect if your sexuality and your gender are aligned or not. So if it's cisgender, that your sexuality and gender are likely to be aligned. And people could be cisgender or different. So it just, it's a differentiation or notation on the fact that sexuality and gender are viewed separately and that they're both on a spectrum rather than binary as male and female.
Thank you for the explanation.
I'm happy to explain. I'm glad you asked. Oh, wow. What an impressive group. It's a privilege to be amongst you all. I know that it takes time to do all these introductions, but I think it makes the conversation so much more rich, knowing who's in the room and what you may be able to bring to the table at the same time. So I appreciate you having taken the time to do the introductions. I'm going to try and jump right into the training. And as I said before, please feel free to interrupt as I go through that. So what we'll be doing overall is, I'm going to give you just an overview of the different theoretical frameworks that have been in place for the notion of multiculturalism, right? So we used to talk a lot about cultural competence. Those were the frameworks initially, and then we went to cultural humility, was talked about a lot. And the recent and most upcoming sort of frameworks have been in the realm of cultural awareness. So we'll talk about that. And then DEI and social justice, how does that fit into all of this? What are the different diversity stages? And then we have been hearing a lot about structural biases, right? They're implicit biases and whatnot, but they're structural biases and institutional ways in which we could shift ourselves as well, and how all of these components work together. So this is sort of an overview of what the next hour or so may look like. So when we're in deep stuff, look straight ahead, keep your mouth shut and say nothing. That has been often the state of conversations in regards to diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? It makes people uncomfortable, and out of wanting to not say anything that's inappropriate, or like people don't engage in conversations about that. So I think just prefacing this conversation that we're about to have with that made sense. And just acknowledging the fact that, even though I've been doing this work for 15, 16 years, I still have my own biases, that we all have those in place, whether we are consciously aware of them or not. I still can make comments that may be in some way or another biased. We all have parts of our identity that are privileged and parts of our identity that are marginalized. And when we are speaking from our privileged place, we can make comments or engage in ways of being that can be biased and prejudiced. So just owning that upfront. Okay, so why are we talking about cultural awareness, right? Cultural responsiveness and awareness is much more so the term that's relevant these days, at least in the literature that's up and coming, because it affects health disparities, obviously communication, interaction, whether it's with client or any other person, the illness experience, what an individual is going through, healthcare outcomes, all of those things are impacted by our cultural responsiveness. Being culturally responsiveness is about understanding your client or any other person that you're working with and their cultural norms, their cultural background, and what all of that means in a particular setting. So, the setting makes a difference. I find myself to be a very different person in different settings. I've noticed and learned over time that when I am within the Western culture in the US, I'm much more engaged in terms of whether I make eye contact or not, whether I touch somebody or not. It varies when I'm in a different cultural setting. Like in Pakistan, I think I'm much more aware of whether I'm making contact with an elder or not across a gender line, whether I'm making physical contact or not, whether I'm touching somebody or not, whether I give somebody a kiss or not. Like my tone, my voice changes, whether I'm standing or sitting down when I'm speaking to another person. All of those are shifts that happen within me on an unconscious level. It's taken me a long time to recognize the ways in which I'm different. So I think, there are ways in which the context changes, and recognizing that cultural responsiveness takes the context into account, and that these are not static ways of being, that people may be diverse in ways, but then they engage in different setting also changes. So the notion of a cultural awareness and responsiveness is based on context. And that, the idea is to meet people where they are, and that people may be at different levels of awareness about cultural, about their own identities, about how they make sense of the world or other people. And that, the context within which clients live is, it's the role of those of us who are practitioners or who are engaging with these people to be aware of the fact that, everybody's a product of the culture within which they live. So if they're in a hospital setting, or if you're seeing somebody in an outside setting, where they are also makes a difference, because those structural ways in which things are set up are often hierarchical. So there's a power dynamic that is at play in multiple spaces. So context is really important in that sense as well. In order to, figure out barriers, we have to think of whether it's, as a practitioner or patient, that's the model that it's been written about. The cultural responsiveness model is embedded in that, but it's universally applicable to any interaction with another human being, so to speak. So responsive healthcare or responsive way of engaging. To care for someone, I must know who I am first. To care for someone, I must know who the other person is. And to care for someone, I must be able to bridge the gap between myself and the other. It's very simplistically stated, but it's really important because our older models have often talked about having cultural knowledge about the other person. Like we should understand where they're coming from to be able to do more effective work. But the idea is that I think we need to understand ourselves and the other and how the two humans. So cultural competence, that used to be the main model. Everything was embedded in cultural competence notions, and that's what's been written about. And I think it's important to sort of understand that, cultural competence didn't really have an operational definition. There were no reliable outcome measures of this. And no measurable relationship between different variables had been placed, and that mental health disparities of all kinds of racial and ethnic minority groups continue to exist despite having had this model. And to understand that it's a product of the 1960s and 70s, when the socio-political climate of civil rights movement was in place. And things have shifted in ways from that. And the challenges with the model, I've tried to keep it fairly simple, and I've described it as a totality problem, the numbers problem, and the idealization problem. I'll go into each one. The totality problem. So if you just think of the definition of culture, right, it's quite broad. The totality of socially transmitted behavior, patterns, arts, beliefs, institutions, and all other product of human work and thought. It's quite broad. If you think of competence, it's a state or quality of being adequate or well qualified. And if you put it together, the idea that you're going to be adequate and well qualified to provide effective services across a totality of behaviors, socially transmitted behaviors and ways of being, and all of the products of human work and thought, it's just an impossible sort of a task to accomplish, right? And then you think of the numbers problem. If you just think of the multiple aspects of diversity that some of you were just naming, race, these are some of the basic 8, but add to that, height, size, like all other body structure, whatnot, multiple ways of being, right? So if these are the 8 ways of being, and people, whom we encounter come with all those aspects of identity. If you just take these 8 ways of being and intersect them, right? There are 40,000 plus ways of being just with these identities, social identities. So people, when we encounter them, to know all these ways of being is an impossibility. So we can't possibly know a person, can't say, somebody's Asian, they're likely to be this way. There are multiple groups of Asians. If we talk about Pakistanis, or Indians, it can't be a universal way of being an Indian because there are so many different ways in which religion or different religions within that ethnicity can be intersected, or different aspects of one's gender or other identities, social identities that intersect with that would be formulated. So then there's the idealization problem. It's almost this idea that we are going to be learning and learning and learning about a group of people or ourselves, and then we're going to reach this place and we're competent somehow. Poof, and that's just not the reality. You can't be competent in this domain. It's impossible to be competent as such. One, because people are complex, there are multiple intersecting identities, and our world is changing. The context is changing. So I think it's the notion of cultural competence has really been outdated in that sense. It's impossible to acquire knowledge about every group and subgroup and religion and class within a group, right? And so how do you keep up with the emerging groups that are constantly migrating and coming out of into our practices or work, right? So, and our world is shifting, the possibility of, crossing borders and is much more likely. So it's hard to be competent in this area. So because we're continuously evolving, right? So that's how the shift, from that model to cultural competency took place. So cultural competence is obviously, the ability to engage knowledgeably with people across cultures. Obviously, like I was explaining, it's a product of 1960s, socio-political climate of civil rights movements. And it became very ubiquitous in like healthcare particularly, and how to become competent in this practice, right? Like I said, this leads to categorical knowledge, so people start assuming. So there are lots of institutions that would have like, we have Latino mental health services, or we have African-American serving population, like this is what our groups, there's a way in which lots of institutions started implementing programming that was based for cultural groups. And in some ways it helps because the linguistic and overarching aspects that may be similar, and you have data and research about particular groups and their needs. But what also started happening was that biases started emerging out of that, stereotypes. This idea that there's an endpoint of becoming fully culturally competent. So I think we're starting to shift away from that and recognizing that knowledge about groups is important, but we cannot fully utilize that knowledge to make judgments or be informed and make assumptions that everybody within the group is going to be endorsing those ways of being and thinking. So over time, the notion of cultural humility has come into play, and that's what most of the 1980s have been about, right? So cultural humility, it incorporates a lifelong commitment to self-evaluation and self-critique. So you're looking at yourself, who am I? What am I doing? How am I engaging? What are my identities? What am I aware of? And to addressing the power imbalances. In our world, power imbalances exist. We live in a dynamic world, and institutions have power dynamics, families have power dynamics. So how do we work within these dynamics, and how do we recognize what are parts of us that may be oppressed or marginalized, or parts of us that are privileged, and how do we use those parts that are privileged to advocate and for those that are marginalized, but that's within ourselves or others, right? So this notion of cultural humility incorporates the idea that you ought to be humble about the assumptions you make. We all make assumptions. We're making that without our awareness often, right? So being aware of what those assumptions are, like being humble that I do make assumptions, and owning that. Understanding my own background and culture. It took me a long time to recognize that, when I was living in Pakistan, I had a certain idea of what being a Muslim woman was. And when I moved to Africa, I was still Muslim, but I was in a Muslim community, but the idea of being Muslim over there was very different than in Pakistan. And it was because the ethnic part of my identity intersected with that. The gender part of my identity intersected with that. So what is it that was shifting and changing? What parts was I holding on to? What was I endorsing? What was I not endorsing? How I was dressing, what I was eating, what the climate and weather was like. It was shifting my ways of being. And what gender I had, it mattered in those two contexts very differently. And when I moved to the US, what aspects of my identity were more apparent to me? Which parts take a backseat, which were in the forefront, and which ones do I utilize consciously, and which ones are I play unconsciously? It's been an interesting learning process, and it's ongoing. I just traveled with a friend from here who identifies as an LGBTQ woman, and I traveled with her back to Pakistan, and it was just fascinating for both of us to see how she perceived me. She's known me for 20 plus years, and how she perceived me as being completely different when I was in that setting, and how I was much more assertive in some ways, but I was also very laid back and letting other people make decisions. And how here I'm a leader and I make the decisions very actively. Over there with my elders and family, I have to ask them about their opinions before deciding. So these are things I didn't even think of, and how she was received in that setting. and what judgments or ideas were posed onto that and how people received. Some were like familiar to her, some totally unfamiliar. And my husband and her were sitting on a chair, and like, you know, woman walked in, their family was like, oh, she's sitting on the bed with him, talking to him. And for the two of them was like, well, it's not a big deal. But if they were doing that in this setting, none of us would think that's a big deal. But in that setting, I was very aware of how that dynamic may be perceived. It's just interesting and fascinating and so complex, right? So how do you begin to incorporate this knowledge into your work, right? That is, it's a lifelong learning process, and we have to understand that things are not going to be apparent to us. And that emphasizing respect and negotiating service plans, and like, how do we operate as an individual who's culturally aware? You have to just first own and understand who you are, and how that's play and how that's shifting and changing, and at the same time have the cultural knowledge of a certain group. It's okay to have both, right? So even though the cultural competence model is older and cultural humility model is newer, now we're moving towards a model that is incorporating both. So there are lots of different terms that have been outright. There's cultural competency and humility that we talked about, but then there's also cultural knowledge, you know, familiarizing yourself with different cultural characteristic, history, systems, and behaviors of different ethnic groups. There's cultural sensitivity models, like how do we, you know, intersect with people across similarities and differences? How's emotion associated with that? And this cultural intelligence, which is more, you know, a term used in business, education, government, and academic research. It's about your capacity to relate and work across different cultures. Many of you do clearly, you know, and how that's incorporated. And then cultural agility is, you know, how do you incorporate and successfully work within different multiple cultural contexts and locations, which is what you were also referring to that some of you are doing. So how does all of this come together? So cultural responsiveness is the idea that, you know, you want to have cultural knowledge. It's not that you shouldn't have cultural knowledge. You should have cultural competence, meaning that you should have basic knowledge about certain groups, right? Like the civil rights movement. What is the history? What is the history of racism in this country? You know, what have been some of those belief systems? So what have been the experiences of people from different, you know, racial, ethnic, gender-based backgrounds, or any other background? Like, so you want to know the culture, you want to be aware of and confident in some general sort of a way, but not let those generalizations inform or dictate how you're going to be a certain group. So continuously challenging your own assumptions. So hold the cultural competence, but engage in a cultural humility sort of oriented fashion where you're recognizing that these power dynamics are there and they're shifting and changing, and they're different social identities and they're intersecting, and the people are complex. And how are you going to respond to somebody is based on who they are, what their identity is, what cultural knowledge you have about them, and figuring out a humble and humility, like cultural humility informed way of like engaging with them. So you're humble about it, you'll enter knowing that you may not know. So opening up conversations about culture, or owning when you may say something that was inappropriate, and being more receptive to hearing and taking in and sharing these ideas. So it's very prevalent these days in terms of the cultural responsiveness is being talked about in healthcare settings for sure, and other spaces as well in academia, becoming more prevalent. Like, you want the cultural competence and knowledge and awareness, but you also want to engage in a way of being that is informed by your own self and by your own identities, and taking the identities of other into account, yet recognizing that we're operating within systems that are imbalanced and hierarchical, and their power dynamics at play, and that they're shifting and changing. So it's a whole lot to hold. So it feels like it's an impossible task, but with time, I think one becomes better and better at it. And then we go into this DEI. I heard, you know, people saying like, what does that really mean? And being, you know, a suspect of it in some ways. It is, I mean, the program that I'm in is the oldest in the nation working on DEI trainings, and they were not received well historically. And since George Floyd and some of the recent incidents, DEI is incorporated everywhere. Like everybody's talking about it, the generic statements being made, and DEI is given value, and it's there's more room for conversations on the topic than there have been historically. So you have to think of like, you know, it's a good movement, but to what end, and the authenticity of it, and how do you do this thoughtfully, rather than just having statements and not really incorporating it in the way that could be useful within institutions or otherwise. So obviously the diversity definition is apparent to all of us. And then, you know, think of the diversity sort of layers, right? So, so I assume some of you may have seen this, but you know, this sort of thinking about your own self. You know, we operate in multiple ways. At the center, it may be us, like our personality, our ways of being, how we communicate. The communication is like outside just the language, and linguistic aspects are obviously a big part of it, like, but also how do we communicate and exchange things with other, and all of that's embedded in internal ways of being, which are like our social identities, ethnicities, age, ability, all of that, the 8 aspects that I was mentioning, but extending beyond that. Like, what are the external ways, like, you know, how much income we, or what is our immigration status? What is our educational background? What is our appearance like? Are we first generation? What is our parental status? What are our personal habits? What is our work experience? Where geographic location that you were all talking about? What is our political affiliation, marital status? All the judgments associated with all of these aspects of identity and affiliation within the larger context. And we make judgments about that, right? We have internal narratives that are in place, and we take them in from a larger society that we're part of. You know, growing up, you know, when I was living in Libya for 11 years, that was when the US had attacked Libya, and I was a child, and I was like, oh my God, what is this country that, you know, that has attacked us? I had a very particular image of what that was like, until when we moved here, I had lots of mixed feelings about like, where are we moving? And recognizing, but those are assumptions based on the little that I know, right? So we take in what we hear, and those inform our ways of then perceiving and engaging. And, you know, so just those are simple examples, but I think it's easy to forget that we think of it often in terms of race or ethnicity and gets limited there. And then now there's more conversation about, you know, gender and sexuality and the right terminology. And then we, you know, are we thinking about age? Are we thinking about ability? Are we thinking about, so those are even still more part of the conversation, but all these other aspects are often not. And then you extend it to organizational level in which we operate, right? So the Rotary Club that you're talking about, or other entities that you're a part of, like, what seniority level do you have? What was your management status? What was the work location? You know, your union affiliation that you are all referring to. So all of these together inform who we are and how we understand ourselves and how we may perceive others. So there's this social matrix exercise. One of our faculty members within our program developed it, and many institutions are utilizing it now. So if you want to just search for it, I think it's a great tool. It's called the social matrix. I'm happy to email it to so you can pass it on to the whole group. But it's an exercise where you enter all aspects of your identity, and it gives you a graph of like your privileges and your marginalizations. So you're much more consciously aware of ways in which you're privileged or marginalized, and it takes into account not just the 8 aspects of diversity, but the multiple complex aspects of identity and diversity and context. So you can figure out where you are. I often do that in my work with students, or in my work with other people that I'm engaging with, ask them to fill it out, look at my own, and figure out, okay, this person is really marginalized in this way. This person, I'm really privileged in this way. How are these aspects of our identity going to intersect? So it's a conscious way of thinking about ourselves and others that we may not be unconsciously aware of. So it's a great tool to have. And it's free and it's online, and you can utilize it. So I'm happy to send that link along as well. cultural iceberg. I'm sure many of you have seen it. You know, we talk about aspects of identity that are, you know, embedded in, like, you know, easy to see things, you know, that are on surface level. How do we, what holidays and festivals we celebrate, you know, what kind, the way we dress, what food we eat, what language we use, but there are lots of other ways of being that are difficult to see that are associated with our culture, like how childbearing practices, like, you know, it's like I'm raising a child, and, you know, I found myself hesitant talking to my doctor here in the West when I'm talking about the fact that she's 5 years old and she still co-sleeps with myself and my, you know, my husband. And I apparently didn't have that difficulty explaining this to the physicians when I was not in this country. When I travel, I can more easily say that. And what is that about? Because it is so culturally common in other settings to do that, while it's not so common here. And there's an emphasis on, you know, individuation and separation. So these are things that we often don't think about, right? The notion of modesty it's a very different way. Like I was much more wanting to know what the opinion about everybody was, all the faculty members, especially those who were the elders in the group who had been part of the program for much longer. And as a younger faculty member amongst them, my culture very much valued and incorporated in your decisions. So that's culturally embedded way of thinking. It's much more collective rather than individualistic, which is much more common here, right? So it's just all these ways of being that we often don't think about that are part of our identities and inform the way we value or place value on certain things or not place value in other things. So equity, you know, obviously is a fair treatment access. So if you look at this image, right, equality is about everybody having the same, like all the three of these, you know, individuals are standing on the 3 boxes, and equality is like about that. But equity is like, okay, this person is shorter, they should have 2 boxes to be able to see this, right? So that's just a simplistic visual way of talking about how diversity, equality, and equity are related. And then this includes all individuals feel welcome, supported, respected, and valued. It's really difficult to do. People have different ways of being, and you know, there's a lot of debate about you know, restrooms these days and settings and who's included and gender affirming practices. So even there are ways in which we have become more inclusive and thoughtful and aware, but we have only touched the surface of what can be done in this domain. Settings, and people are diverse already been, you know, lack of diversity in race or gender and whatnot, but you know, it's much broader than that. Remembering that equity and equality, how those are different, but the social justice idea is about equality is an assumption that everyone benefits from the same supports, right? So they have the same three boxes. Inequity is the idea that, you know, the person with who's the shortest should have more boxes so they can have the same visual. And injustice is the idea, why do we even have a barrier? Like, why are systems set up in such a way, barriers? So here all three can see the game without supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequity is addressed. So it's a systemic barrier, right? So that's what social justice orientation is about. Look about what's just, how should structures and systems be set up so they're more social justice oriented. I feel like I'll be probably myself here, but microaggressions, I'm sure you've heard plenty on this. It's, you know, people obviously engage in macroaggressions, ways of, you know, harming or prejudicial ways of being or stating things that are harmful to the other person, but they're also microaggressions are much more common and not often caught because they're the slight ways of saying things or doing things, or, you know, some common example people give is like, oh, you speak English so well, if to somebody who's BIPOC, right? Because, oh, the assumption is that they are, you know, not going to be able to speak English well. Unintentional ways of saying things, so those are in existence, obviously, and then unconscious biases that we're talking about already. Unconscious biases and implicit biases, how are they different and how are they similar? This is basic. Try not to go into now for discussion as well. So diversity stages, how they're written about, right? When you are figuring out whether you are informed, culturally informed, what stage are you at? Like, you know, people can get a denial phase. There's no awareness of cultural differences. In extreme cases may claim cultures are subhuman. Then there's defensive ways of being, which is perceived thrust against one's comfortable viewpoint, use negative stereotyping, assumes your own culture is superior. Then there's minimizing differences. Trivializes differences, focuses on similarity. We're all similar, we're all the same, there are no differences. Then you come to an acceptance level, where accept behavior differences and underlying differences in values exist. Recognize validity of other ways of thinking. State and integration be simplified in this way. I think about it when I'm explaining it to students that I'm teaching or others, that think of it this way. Intolerance, these are the people who think, you know, I don't know and I don't care and I don't, and or I do know and I still don't care. Yes, I'm different. I don't really care. I know I should, but I don't. Then there's an incapacity. I know and I care, but I don't know what to do with it. Many people are in this stage. Like they know and they care, but they don't know what to do with it. Like they want the skills, they want the tools to do this right, but they just don't know. Competency, I know, I care, and I know what to do, or I know how to find out what to do. So this, you know, it's competency idea still, but it's just the idea that, well, you know, I care, I know that this is what matters, but, and I may not know, but I know where to go to find out how to learn more about this. So ineffective strategies, very often, very common, people do nothing. And earlier in our, you know, trainings that we used to do about 10 years back, plus people would not want to have this conversation. They were not interested in diversity, multicultural biases. Conversation was just made people very uncomfortable. Or when the conversation came up, you know, people would sidetrack it or change the topic, or people who were upset in that realm or talking about issues, they would appease the participants, or terminate the discussion, or become defensive or start explaining, you know, oh, I didn't mean this. Yes, you know, people can do things and they don't mean to or intend to, but it still has an impact on the other, and acknowledging that impact is important. Effective strategy, be patient-centered or human-centered. Let them lead the way and inform you when you're working with another person, with a student or another individual. Let them inform you if you don't know. Understand your own identity and positionality, and be aware and acknowledge and admit your own possible biases. Notice nonverbal cues, understand meaning behind emotional expressions, understand differences in communication styles, ask openly about potentially relevant traditions, customs, recruit diverse staff. It makes a difference. Partner with the community. Those are just some of the effective strategies. Broaching is another concept and way of thinking about it. Do not address differences as deficiency, but as strengths. Acknowledge within group differences, don't assume. Acknowledge role of cultures. These are just basic things that, you know, I think are self-explanatory to a great extent. Hey, I'm going to pause here. And if you could just take a couple of minutes to think of the people to whom you're the closest. Who are your trusted five? Think of people that you trust the most. Put their initials for yourself if you have a pen, or that you want to do it mentally, however, you know, but this is a good exercise for us to engage in for ourselves or for others. And think of those five people, and then list their gender, their race, their age, sexual orientation, all these aspects. think it's been really helpful. And generally we share this and we ask the group to come back and we have a conversation about it. But the idea is to get ourselves to consciously think of how are there overlapping aspects of identity, how diverse or not diverse our core inner trusted circle is, and whether those similarities that exist are based on race or gender, ethnicity, education. What are those about? I think those is a simple way of starting to think about your own self and how we may orient ourselves, or who do we surround ourselves with. So I would encourage you to sort of like do this, whether you do that or with another person, but I think it's a useful tool. Let me see what time. Some individual humility, cultural humility, there's structural humility. There's a lot of conversation about when we are in systems. So structural racism is often talked about. So what does it mean, right? So individual that we were talking about, like how individually we are conscious or unconscious, we externalize our behavior, we internalize it, what our beliefs and actions are. And there's institutional and structural aspects, right? So policies and practices that entities utilize, organizations utilize that can perpetuate oppression. And there's structural ways of being across institution, like historically what has happened. What kind of curriculum do we have? What kind of books are not allowed? What is allowed? What are we reading? What courses are offered? Do these books represent people from different backgrounds? Whose stories are dominant? Whose stories are left out? And so institutions and structurally we have ways of operating, and individually we have ways of operating. And how the two come together, the interaction between people, both within and across difference, is the area where conflict often comes out of. So there's structural ways of thinking, social determinants of health, right? Economic stability, neighborhood, education, food, community, like all of these things that are talked about as social determinants of health. We can't talk about our own selves and our biases and identities and that of the other without thinking of the structural aspect, right? So your zip code predicts your health better than any race or genetics do. And that's true, it's the reality, right? Seek to shift traditional competency trainings and beliefs and behavior of individual patterns to bigger picture as well. We have to think of the larger structural aspects. Social context in which people live and work matters. So how do we think about structural competency and structural humility? Those are some of the core ideas, and I won't have time to go in detail into any of these, but think of people like, let's say somebody's missing appointments or there are gaps in their care. Then we might think, oh, they're not interested in treatment, they don't give importance to healthcare, but it might be due to simply transportation barriers, lack of insurance, homelessness, people who have asthma, could be uncontrolled diseases due to mold, or like where they live. Diabetes could be about food insecurity and lack of spaces for exercise where they are. Hypertension could be about inability to afford medication. So there are lots of ways in which we don't think of the structural lens when we're making assumptions about people that we work with. So I think those are important to take into account if we fully want to understand somebody. So there are ways of probing about that. So lots of, there's a structural vulnerability assessment that one can conduct. And then, there's screening tools to assess for social needs that are free and available and online. These are just some of the ones that I've listed here. And then how do all these ways and, how do all these sort of disciplines work together to support an individual? And we think, when we're doing this sort of work, we're doing culturally informed DEI work. This is how it is, and we're going in, and often in the reality, it's messy, it's complex, it's simple. Here, I've said a lot, I've been speaking nonstop, but I want to open it up for questions, thoughts, comments, discussion for the last 10 minutes or so that we have. I'm happy to stay longer and happy to share more resources and these PowerPoint slides so you can look more into these as well.